on purpose.
What's that? Give you guys assignments?
Well, no, you're very consistent.
Yeah, I'm late on grading. Yesterday I drove with Shesky. We put like signs up and stuff like that. So usually Monday's my day to grade and put stuff up. So I'm a little bit behind. So you guys will probably get quite a bit coming to you here, like grade one. All right, to pull up notes I sent out this morning, I want to finish up the section here on Renaissance artists. We'll talk about like literature too here a little bit. So don't type anything out here because this is just a kind of a transition slide from my pending Alzheimer's. So last week again we were talking about kind of Renaissance artists. We were talking about the Ninja Turtles, but primarily we've been mainly talking about Italy, right? Northern Italy. So we started talking about Florence, which is oftentimes considered the birthplace of the Renaissance, but the Renaissance spreads throughout Northern Italy. Milan, Venice in particular has a kind of what they call school or kind of like a scene there. We talked about people like Titian, Giorgione. I left out Bellini, right? But eventually, as time goes on, the kind of Renaissance kind of trickles out of Italy, and ideas make their way to places like Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, France, England, and that. And so they often refer to that simply as the Northern Renaissance, right? And again, like there's some these kind of some of these artists spend time in Italy, bring that back to their places here. One guy in particular who's kind of sometimes considered kind of the first great kind of Northern Renaissance artist is Albert Dürer, right? Who's from Nuremberg, Germany. He's by trade initially a goldsmith, and that's going to benefit him when he's and he engages in oil paintings and then goes to Venice, studies under Bellini, kind of mixes kind of Florentine and Venetian ideas. Colors from Venice, the idea of kind of emphasizing on colors, but also kind of shapes and triangles, like when we're talking about kind of in the Florentine school. But Dürer really kind of distinguishes himself as an engraver in these kind of metal engravings, and that's kind of probably from his kind of background as a goldsmith. A lot of his engraving, there's one engraving they may be familiar with. Some people have a popular tattoo. But he's by a lot of artists, particularly in Germany and Nuremberg in that area, is kind of credited with kind of starting the scene there. So this is Dürer's self-portrait. Again, a lot of these guys have these self-portraits that are very much the use of mirrors and stuff that looks very kind of intense. This is his version of Lamentation, which is a kind of a popular theme by other artists, and that, kind of Jesus being taken down from the cross. You can see the influence of Florence here with kind of the emphasis of kind of the triangle, which kind of draws your eye in there. From Venice, kind of the use of colors, particularly because of the red cloak and that you get that sense of perspective in the background, and that, like I said, but really distinguishes them as an engraver. This is probably his most famous engraving. This is in metals. It's called Praying Hands. Have you ever seen this before? This is kind of a popular engraving. One year I was teaching this, a kid pulled up his shirt and he had this on his shoulder, on his arm, he had the tattoo. All right, which is kind of a popular tattoo. But the detail with this is particularly impressive with kind of you see the veins even there, the kind of rolling up with the sleeve. This is St. Jerome in his study. This is a good one that shows kind of perspective and a sense of depth there. The lion and lamb laying together kind of represents peace. And then also you'll see Dürer and other artists will continue to kind of throw in these kind of skulls in there, even though we're about 100 years or so past the Black Death. Periodically, the plague kind of reemerges in that. And so, like I said, they refer to the dance macabre. Also, memento mori, which is Latin meaning, everyone dies, kind of to a certain extent, kind of plays into that role there. This is his version of Adam and Eve, which have some strategically placed fig leaves. Thur's a little bit more kind of conservative in that sense. He illustrates a number of kind of Protestant prayer books in that. He's going to be a big fan of kind of Luther. This is Melancholia, which is basically the angel Gabriel, and you see the ruffle with the dress and that. And then this is Night, Devil and Death. There's a lot to unpack with this one. It's heavy emphasis here on kind of imagery, like his skulls, his goat there, which is really kind of ominous. So again, this is all metal engravings, and that's where kind of Dürer kind of separates himself from kind of other artists. Another German artist that's significant, who actually makes a name for himself in England, is Hans Holbein. Sometimes referred to as Hans Holbein the Younger, because his father was an artist as well. His kind of portraits are generally kind of associated with Henry VIII. He was the main portrait painter in the court of Henry VIII. So almost every portrait we have of Henry VIII, particularly as king, was generally painted by Holbein. Anybody that's associated with the court, from his chancellors to his wives and that. And then Henry VIII is particularly famous for one of the things, for having 6 wives. 2 of them he has beheaded and stuff. And so he puts a big emphasis on Holbein's skill as a portrait painter. His 4th wife, Henry married without ever meeting her. Her name was Anne of Cleves, and she was from Germany. So what Henry did was sent Holbein to Germany to do her portrait. And when he returned, he showed her the portrait. He was a little disappointing when she showed up, though. All right, so the wedding, I kind of explained that. But like this is like kind of Henry VIII. That's his portrait. All right. Again, almost every portrait is kind of painted by Holbein. Kind of larger than life figure. I'll talk about him on more detail Thursday when we talk about the Reformation in England. And this is Anne of Cleves. All right, his 4th wife. Now, like I said, when Holbein returns from Germany and kind of shows this portrait to Henry, he's like, okay, she'll do. The story was when she got to England, first time they met, that was not the same woman he this is kind of maybe an example of like a filter, maybe to a certain extent. There's a couple of theories. One theory is that Holbein may have made her out to be a little bit, maybe kind of embellished a little bit because he was in love with her. Another theory is that Henry VIII wasn't really, this was something that was kind of orchestrated by one of his chancellors, right? And so he wasn't on board with this kind of marriage, and the marriage wasn't completely consummated, so to speak, all right? But again, he put a big emphasis on Holbein's abilities. This is a portrait called The Ambassadors, which is probably his, outside of anything associated with Henry VIII, is probably his most famous portrait. These are 2 French brothers. One, the guy on the left, serves as a diplomat in the kind of the English court for the King of France. The other one is his brother, who's a kind of a clergyman in the Catholic Church. This is an example of what maybe we could later call a still life, where you have kind of images of like things that people use in their everyday life here. It's just incredibly detailed. Like the globe here shows like a very detailed image of Europe. There's the lute. This is a prayer book, but the prayer book is actually a Lutheran prayer book. Holbein kind of threw in there, which was kind of like basically a little kind of because these guys are Catholic. But then also there's something really kind of weird that's kind of, if you notice on the bottom, you guys see things out of place.
That looks like a poster.
The skull.
Yeah, it's a skull. Yeah, that skull. It's an example of anamorphism, where you basically kind of distort something, you kind of long kind of stuff. So the reasons are somewhat debatable. Holbein never really kind of fully explained why. There's one theory that these guys were okay with it. This is an example of memento mori. And then the idea is that depending how you look at it, like this was a painting that was going to hang in the stairwell, that if you came up the steps, you'd be able to see it like full on like that. And then if you turned, it would kind of slightly be kind of turned a bit. But that's like probably more, and again, it looks like a photograph. It's incredibly detailed. This one's called the Darmstadt altarpiece, which again, the Virgin Mary and kind of baby Jesus. This was basically commissioned by this guy, who was a German merchant. Over here was his wife who had passed away, and then that was his new wife and his daughter. They're not totally sure who these 2 people are. There's a belief that this might be like John the Baptist, that whole kind of nod to kind of like Leonardo and Raphael and Michelangelo and stuff like that. But not totally sure. But again, it's very kind of photographic to a certain extent. There's a definite detail with like even like things like the kind of the fluting here, or the mantelpiece. And then what we start to see in kind of as the Renaissance kind of extends north, a region called Flanders that kind of serves as almost like kind of Florence of the North. Flanders is primarily Belgium, right? And those, like explained, they're referred to as Flemish, all right? Plus parts of France, the Netherlands, the Lowland countries. Like in northern Italy, we start to see the emergence of a merchant class with new money. All right, and these are people that are with that new money. They're going to show that wealth out. They're going to basically kind of hire portrait painters and stuff like that. So it becomes a hotbed for not just merchants but artisans as well, and get into the 1500s here. And then like later we'll talk about like kind of in the Netherlands. One of the big like kind of things that was traded was tulips, and there was almost like kind of like a stock exchange with tulips that kind of emerged here. So you have a number of merchants that. Again, it was like Dogecoin in its day. It was kind of inflated as like how much it's really worth. But you had a number of merchants that made quite a bit of money off of basically trading in flowers. All right. So one of the first great kind of Renaissance artists of kind of Flanders is a guy named Jan van Eyck. Van Eyck is going to make his living as a portrait painter. He's going to be basically the one that the merchants kind of look towards. One of his famous portrait paintings is that of an Italian merchant and his wife, something called the wedding portrait, taken after their marriage. And then his own self-portrait, which is often referred to as Red Turban. So he's rubbing elbows with the wealthy. He is also going to be commissioned by the church to produce something called the Ghent altarpiece, which I'll show you. And it's one of the kind of more controversial, or at least stolen paintings that's associated with Flanders there. So this is the wedding portrait. And art historians have kind of analyzed this for centuries here. This is again another kind of example like Holbein kind of we would classify as a still life. So over here you have this Italian merchant who kind of looks like Vladimir Putin to a certain extent. Your eye is kind of drawn to the reds and the greens. All right, even back here, like this mirror, you can't quite tell there's a reflection of kind of like you would see their backside in the mirror there. But the controversy with this, which is a bit debatable, is the wife, particularly her dress. What does it look like with her hand in her placement there?
She's pregnant.
Yeah, she looks like she's pregnant. There's a number of art historians who've debated this, whether this was an actual shotgun wedding or but that's kind of how the dress was kind of setting, or Ike was basically inferring that they're going to have a successful marriage or something like that. That's all very debatable. But again, this is like a wealthy merchant who's basically paying for basically his portrait to be painted. And then this is Red Turban, all right, the self-portrait, which is very detailed in like everything from like, the creases in like around his lips, basically, his eyes, all the creases that you would have from that. And then the turban is incredibly detailed. But there's one painting that is actually a series of panels that he painted partly with his brother called the Ghent altarpiece that just recently was basically kind of presented to the public for the first time since the 1930s. These altarpieces are meant to be kind of displayed in churches, right, at the altars there. This is one of the more controversial kind of paintings because it went missing, or at least part of it went missing. And people like Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were kind of like, Hitler was kind of obsessed with this painting. And so this is kind of a video that talks about why this is one of considered the most
Throughout 6 centuries, the Ghent altarpiece has been burned, forged, and raided in 3 different wars. It is, in fact, the world's most stolen artwork, and while it's told some of its secrets, it's kept others hidden. In 1934, the police of Ghent, Belgium, heard that one of the altarpiece's panels, split between its front and back, was suddenly gone. The commissioner investigated the scene, but determined that a theft at a cheese shop was more pressing. 12 ransom notes appeared over the following months, and one half of the panel was even returned as a show of good faith. Meanwhile, art restorer Jeff van der Weken made a replica of the other half for display until it was found, but it never was. Some suspected that he was involved in the theft and, once ransom demands failed, had simply painted over the original and presented it as his copy. But a definitive answer wouldn't come for decades. Just 6 years later, Hitler was planning a grand museum, but was missing his most desired possession, the Ghent altarpiece. As Nazi forces advanced, Belgian leaders sent the painting to France, but the Nazis commandeered and moved it to a salt mine, converted into a stolen art warehouse that contained over 6,000 masterpieces. Near the war's end in 1945, a Nazi official decided he'd rather blow up the mine before letting it fall into Allied hands. In fact, the Allies had soldiers called monuments men who were tasked with protecting cultural treasures. 2 of them were stationed 570 kilometers away when one got a toothache. They visited a local dentist who mentioned that his son-in-law also loved art and took them to meet him. They discovered that he was actually one of the Nazis' former art advisors, now in hiding. And miraculously, he told them everything. The monuments men devised a plan to rescue the art, and the local resistance delayed the mine's destruction until they arrived. Inside, they found the altarpiece among other world treasures. The Ghent altarpiece, also called the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb after its central subject, consists of 12 panels depicting the biblical story. It's one of the most influential artworks ever made. When Jan van Eyck completed it in Ghent in 1432, it was immediately deemed the best painting in Europe. For millennia, artists used tempera paint consisting of ground pigment in egg yolk, which created vivid but opaque colors. The altarpiece was the first to showcase the unique abilities of oil paint. They allowed Van Eyck to capture light and movement in a way that had never been seen before. He did this using brushes sometimes as tiny as a single badger hair. And by depicting details like Ghent landmarks, botanically identifiable flowers, and lifelike faces, the altarpiece pioneered an artistic mode that would come to be known as realism. Yet, conservation work completed in 2019 found that, for centuries, people had been viewing a dramatically altered version. Due to dozens of restorations, as much as 70% of certain sections had been painted over. As conservators removed these layers of paint, varnish, and grime, they discovered vibrant colors and whole buildings that had long been invisible. Other details were more unsettling. The mystic lamb's 4 ears had long perplexed viewers, but the conservation team revealed that the second pair was actually a pentimento, the ghost of underlying layers of paint that emerge as newer ones fade. Restorers had painted over the original lamb with what they deemed a more palatable version. They removed this overpainting and discovered the original to be shockingly humanoid. The conservators also finally determined whether Van der Weyken had simply returned the missing panel from 1934. He hadn't. It was confirmed to be a copy, meaning the original is still missing. But there was one final clue. A Ghent stockbroker, while on his deathbed a year after the theft, revealed an unsent ransom note. It reads, "It rests in a place where neither I nor anybody else can take it away without arousing the attention of the public." A Ghent detective remains assigned to the case, but while there are new tips every year, it has yet to be found.
And they just, like I said, last month, they just brought it back out. BBC, I was watching something, they had a big thing on that. They just kind of with minus that missing panel there. Another Flemish painter makes a name for himself is Bruegel. Often referred to as Bruegel the Elder. He's got a son that mainly kind of makes a name for himself as kind of doing copies of paintings. I talked about Bruegel when we talked about the Black Death. I showed you that one painting for the March of Death with all those kind of skeletons and stuff like that. That's a Bruegel painting. Whereas Van Eyck is basically kind of like hobnobbing with the kind of elites there to make a name for himself. Bruegel's doing more observational art. He's observing kind of like commoners and kind of everyday life and basically kind of documenting that. This is often referred to as a peak in kind of Flemish art. The kind of the more famous kind of observational kind of painting that he has is called the Peasant Wedding, which essentially kind of uses the reds here to kind of create a triangle. And just, like the colors even of the soup are supposed to kind of draw your attention in. But these are people that generally their lives are undocumented. All right, but he's just kind of like observing and kind of putting this down. So this is one's called Harvest with these guys, farmers, basically taking a break. And anytime anybody talks about on the Tower of Babel on like a documentary or like that, they undoubtedly show Bruegel's image of the Tower of Babel, which has become the kind of what we think the Tower of Babel looks like to a certain extent. All right. But again, the softer colors here, and the use of perspective and definition are pretty impressive. So. Those are the various artists that kind of like we talked about, but there's other artists I've probably left out about 50 or so. You can have an entire kind of college semester on basically Renaissance artists and stuff like that. And then the last section we'll talk about here is literature. There's a few kind of poets and writers that are significant in the kind of early part of the Renaissance here. The first one, Petrarch, he's a poet, he's a historian. He's the one that gives us the term, like essentially, the Dark Ages, referring to the early part of the Middle Ages here. Petrarch was one of the first ones to use that term humanism, the idea of basically kind of studying classical kind of education, particularly kind of like the emphasis on learning Latin. At that time, Latin was primarily basically kind of language that was used in universities and churches and stuff like that. Petrarch also kind of delved into the life of the Roman orator and senator Cicero. A lot of the information we have is thanks to Petrarch there. But Petrarch's a little bit of an elitist too, all right? But he's the one who's a lot of times people kind of consider him the one to kind of jumpstart the Renaissance, and particularly the idea that basically kind of the kind of learning of kind of Greek and Roman culture and stuff like that is the skeleton key to all education. This here is Petrarch kind of portraying the laurel wreath that kind of associates with that. But not everybody can read Latin, all right? And you start to find kind of people that are writing in what we call their vernacular, their everyday language, all right? One of the more influential ones in Italy, in Florence in particular, is Dante, who lived during the kind of the 13th century, early kind of he like Giotto kind of bridges the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, right? So Dante is going to write a kind of a trilogy. It's a poem and stanzas in that, but it's really a story called the Divine Comedy, and that's a trilogy is a little bit of a nod to kind of Homer in that sense. Where this kind of has its connections with the Middle Ages, that the inspiration for Dante kind of writing this is a young woman by the name of Beatrice, who he was in love with, but this is something called unrequited love. He never acted upon it. He just admires her from afar, right? When she dies, he delves into this idea of trying to find her. So each of these sections are basically kind of, so the first kind of part of the Divine Comedy is Dante's Inferno, where he goes to hell, the 9 rings of hell, and tries to, and he's led through that. His guide is Virgil, the Roman poet who wrote the Aeneid, right? There's various historical figures that I kind of mentioned in there, like Genghis Khan is mentioned. They talk about, like Trajan, various Roman emperors. This is written in Italian, all right? So he's writing not to put any type of elitist, like kind of, he's trying to basically kind of like get people to read this, all right? And some of this is what they call allegoric, and he's basically kind of using certain ideas and stuff like that as a kind of basically kind of a commentary on like kind of church politics and stuff. All right. I'm going to play this little video that talks about why is the Divine Comedy kind of an important.
Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Inscribed above the gate of hell, these ominous words warn dark tidings for Dante as he begins his descent into Inferno. Yet despite the grim tone, this prophecy sets into motion what is perhaps the greatest love story ever told, an epic journey that encompasses both the human and the divine. But for Dante to reach benevolent salvation, he must first find his way through hell. This landscape of torture is the setting for Inferno, the first in a 3-part narrative poem written by Dante Alighieri in the 14th century. Casting himself as the protagonist, Dante travels deeper and deeper into hell's abyss, witnessing obscene punishments distinct to each of its 9 realms. Beginning in limbo, he travels through the circles of lust, gluttony, greed, wrath, heresy, violence, and fraud, to the horrific 9th circle of treachery, where sinners are trapped under the watchful eyes of Satan himself. The following 2 parts, Purgatorio and Paradiso, continue Dante's journey as he scales the Mount of Purgatory and ascends the 9 celestial spheres of heaven. Written together over 10 years, these 3 sections comprise the Divine Comedy, an allegorical imagining of the soul's journey towards God. But Dante's Divine Comedy is more than just religious allegory. It's also a witty, scathing commentary on Italian politics. A soldier and statesman from Florence, Dante was staunchly faithful to God, but often critical of the Roman Catholic Church. He particularly disliked its rampant nepotism and practice of simony, the buying and selling of religious favors such as pardons from sin. Many groups took advantage of these corrupt customs, but few supported them as much as the Guelfi Neri, or Black Guelphs. This was a political and religious faction which sought to expand the Pope's political influence. Dante was a member of the Guelfi Bianchi, or White Guelphs, who believed Florence needed more freedom from Roman influence. As a public representative for the White Guelphs, Dante frequently spoke out against the Pope's power until the Black Guelphs leveraged their position to exile him from Florence in 1302. But rather than silencing him, this lifelong exile led to Dante's greatest critique of all. Dishonored and with little hope of return, the author freely aired his grievances with the Church and Italian society. Writing the Divine Comedy in Italian rather than the traditional Latin of the educated elite, Dante ensured the widest possible audience for his biting political commentary. In the Inferno's circle of the wrathful, Dante eagerly witnesses sinners tear Black Guelph Filippo Argenti limb from limb. In the circle of fraud, Dante converses with a mysterious sinner burning in the circle's hottest flames. He learns that this is Pope Nicholas III, who tells Dante that his two successors will take his place when they die, all three guilty of simony and corruption. Despite the bleak and sometimes violent imagery in Inferno, the Divine Comedy is also a love story. Though Dante had an arranged marriage with the daughter of a powerful Florentine family, he had also been unrequitedly in love with another woman since he was 9 years old, Beatrice Portinari. Despite allegedly meeting just twice, she became Dante's lifelong muse, serving as the inspiration and subject for many of his works. In fact, it's Beatrice who launches his intrepid journey into the pits of hell and up the terraces of Mount Purgatory. Portrayed as a powerful heavenly figure, she leads Dante through Paradiso's concentric spheres of heaven until he is finally face to face with God. In the centuries since its publication, the Divine Comedy's themes of love, sin, and redemption have been embraced by numerous artists, from Auguste Rodin and Salvador Dali to Ezra Pound and Neil Gaiman. And the poet himself received his own belated earthly redemption in 2008, when the city of Florence finally revoked Dante's antiquated exile.
All right, so here's an image of Dante holding the Divine Comedy. So over here is supposed to represent Inferno, hell there, kind of sinners. Purgatory is represented by the Tower of Babel. And over here, Paradiso, or heaven, is kind of represented by Florence. Although Dante wasn't alive when the cathedral, the dome, was kind of finished. Giotto, who I talked about, there was a number of kind of our images of Dante, actually, a lot of that comes from Giotto. And then another writer, and if there are some people have some questions, I think I left out. Dante wrote in Italian. Basically, it was kind of like written in Italian rather than Latin. Another writer that's going to be kind of writing in the everyday vernacular of their region is Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, who is often referred to as kind of the first kind of English poet of the Renaissance, early on there. When I was in high school, we had to read parts of something called the Canterbury Tales, which is essentially a story of these 8 or 9 pilgrims, I can't remember the exact number, that are going to the tomb of Thomas of Becket, who I talked about in chapter 9 was the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was martyred during the time of Henry II, when Henry basically said, "Would somebody just rid me of this meddlesome priest?" with that conflict between kind of canon and common law. It's that as the backdrop. And some of it we didn't read in high school, we just read parts of it. Some of it is rather randy, as the English would say, sexual innuendos and stuff like that. But this is essentially kind of talking to a certain extent, like kind of maybe a little bit kind of skewering kind of like religious pilgrimages and to a certain extent. You guys obviously don't read Chaucer, and they don't kind of read that. Do you guys read Shakespeare? I can't remember. It used to be every year you guys did a Shakespeare play. It's a little bit like this. This is English, but like the language seems a little different, right? This is from the prologue here. Like you'll notice like how like flour and liquor is like kind of spelled a little different. Even still to this day, like kind of in England, like tire, like your car tire, is spelled Tyre. There's like color has a U in it and stuff like that. So there's some slight variations there. But like I said, this is kind of it's a story that's basically trying to get people to read it. It's nothing that's like trying to like be too elitist here. All right. And then also too, like here with this one, this is a progressive era. right? We have people like kind of challenging kind of like, concepts and art and kind of literature and that. It's still pretty much of a boys' club for the most part. Women, unfortunately, in a lot of parts of Europe during the Renaissance, were, unless you were of a certain status, weren't really afforded a lot of education opportunities. And so there's a few there with the exception. Like, for example, Christine de Pizan, who actually, her father was a diplomat. She's from Italy, but her father spent most of his time in France. She was fluent in 3 or 4 languages. After her father died, she basically became part of the French court, served for King Charles V. And so she wrote a book called The Book of the City of Ladies, which basically is it's kind of a feminist book, basically saying that, anything man can do, women can do, all right? And it's a fictional city that's run absolutely kind of, how it's supposed to be run. There's a big emphasis on virtues and stuff like that. She would go around and basically kind of lecture. It's like you're coming, kind of lecture to men about. So, unfortunately, like I said, like a lot of women aren't getting full amount of credit within the Renaissance. But there were women that had made contributions to literature and poetry and all right. So tomorrow, I'm going to talk about the second event that's associated with the late Middle Ages, and that is the Reformation. So we'll talk about Martin Luther and the effect of like kind of the printing press and stuff had on the spread of the Reformation.